Order, order. Good morning and welcome to this meeting of the Environment, Food, Rural Affairs Select Committee. We return today to our ongoing work in relation to the work of DEFRA and its arm's-length bodies. We're delighted to be joined this morning by Paul Kissack, the new Permanent Secretary. Paul, for the benefit of those who are following our proceedings and for our own official record, can I invite you and your colleagues to introduce yourselves to the committee, please?
Thanks very much, Chair. My name is Paul Kissack. I'm the Permanent Secretary at DEFRA.
Morning, I'm David Hill. I'm the Director General Strategy and Water at DEFRA.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Emma Bourne. I'm the Director General for EU Reset and Trade at DEFRA.
And I'm Iain King. I'm the Chief Financial Officer and also Acting Chief Operating Officer.
Okay. Right, well, thank you very much. We appreciate your attendance and your engagement with the committee. Paul, you've been in post now since October of last year. So you've had a chance to see what it is you've taken on as a job. What's your assessment of the department you've inherited then? Where do you see its strengths and weaknesses?
Thank you, Chair. I've been in the department for about 20 weeks as we sit here today. So a few initial reflections, and please sort of bear in mind, I'll caveat these with that I remain very much a newcomer to the department, still finding my way. I think the first thing I would say is, and this is something I did know coming into the department, indeed it's the reason I came into the department and wanted to be there, is that DEFRA is a very important department in terms of what it achieves for the country, what it does for the country, and as a sort of central department within government, one which I think is sometimes underestimated in terms of its importance. Three areas in particular I think it is critical for. The first is around the economy. It is a department of the economy. We are responsible for some of the most important infrastructure underpinning economic life in this country, whether that is our food system, whether that is soils, air, water, nature itself. And indeed, we're responsible for some really important economic sectors, including farming, food and fisheries. Secondly, we're a Department of National Security and Resilience. Again, I think that is a bit underplayed at times, and actually as we sit here today of all weeks, I think the importance of different departments to recognise the role they play in national security is critical. So we are responsible for 2 of the 13 government national critical national infrastructure systems in water and food, and we are also responsible for a large number of risks on the government's risk register, including biosecurity and floods. And then a third theme that I think is really prevalent in the department is around science, actually. So DEFRA plays quite a critical role in the UK's responsibility as a science superpower. We have about 5,000 scientists across the wider organisation, including our arm's-length bodies. I think we have the 5th largest R&D budget, over £500 million a year. And actually, when I've asked the question coming into the department in different areas, where is the world's leading science being done in different areas? Actually, quite often the answer is here in the UK, and I'm not sure we talk about that as much as we could do. So that's why I'm in DEFRA. In terms of things we need to change, and as I should say, not surprisingly, I've spent quite a bit of time reading transcripts of this committee's hearings from recent times, and I think you have raised a number of challenges for us which are both fair and right. And certainly I'm coming into the department recognising some areas that we do need to change. Again, just 3 very briefly, maybe we'll come on to more of them later. The first is actually that I don't think we're always as focused on outcomes as we need to be. This is one of the themes that comes through some of the reviews that were held prior to my arrival, but which have been really helpful for shaping our work, including Dan Corrie's review, the Cunliffe review as well, a sense that we have regulatory systems which are often complicated and insufficiently focused on solutions and looking up and out into what good looks like rather than being focused on process. The second is actually how we engage externally. There's a couple of different things here, and again, I know this has been an area that the committee has looked at particularly and raised concerns about. Some of that, I think, is about our sort of customer service, for want of a better phrase. We do provide services direct to customers, including those we regulate, and how we improve the quality and timeliness of those services is really important. The second is more as a broader point about how we engage with different sectors, including farming and fishing, in the shaping of policies and listening to feedback. And then the third area where I think we need to do more is actually just around efficiency, and that's not unique to DEFRA. That's obviously a challenge for every government department, given the tight fiscal position we are in. But there is definitely more we need to do over the coming years, and indeed we have a stretching savings target across the spending review period, which will require us to do much more, including with digital and AI. So they're the sort of three key sort of shifts I think I will need to lead over the coming years. But if I just finish by, because I don't want to finish on a deficit note, by recognising that actually for all of the changes that we need to see in the department, overwhelmingly my reflection from my first weeks in the department as I've travelled around multiple hubs and been out on visits and met more and more staff, is actually we have an extraordinary number of hard-working, talented, knowledgeable, dedicated staff who are in the department to make a difference. We are making a difference in a lot of areas, whether that's around flooding and extreme weather responses, early changes to the water system, planting record numbers of trees, innovative approaches to restoring nature, reforms to our waste system and addressing waste crime, trade deals. Our Secretary of State is out in America today, in fact, and on ensuring biosecurity through repeated outbreaks. I think DEFRA officials are making an enormous difference for the good of the country, and so alongside leading changes to improve the department, one of the things I want to do is make sure that DEFRA officials feel they are able to stand tall and celebrate those achievements and feel proud about the part they play within government and for the country. Thank you.
Okay. Take a wee sip of water and have a deep breath. Just to pick up on some of that then, I mean, in terms of looking at outcomes, it's fair to say we heard from your predecessor and some of her other senior team, and we weren't particularly impressed. I hope we were fairly measured in the way we described it, but just to quote our own report, departmental officials were not sufficiently alive to the urgency of providing certainty for farmers who must necessarily plan many years ahead. If you are able to deal with the challenges that you've identified quite fairly there, give me a couple of metrics that you would want to point to in a year or 2 years' time and say, that's the change that I have driven.
Well, so to pick up the specific example about the urgency of change for the farming community, and actually, we should just let's go into the sort of the challenge we had around SFI and how we want that to be and feel different. I mean, I think we are proceeding with a degree of urgency in that area. So if I think about, I think the Secretary of State came in and the new Farming Minister in September. The Batters Review was published bang on time, thank you Minette, at the end of October. We then published that and our response in December. We also announced at the same time changes to the IHT reforms. So before Christmas we gave new levels of clarity to the farming community. Then in January at the Oxford Farming Conference, I know you were there, we announced further details of the shape of the SFI. We also announced new funding for farming collaboratives and for the Farming and Protected Landscape scheme. So that was in January. In February, in fact only last week at the NFU conference, we set out further details on SFI, how it's going to be simplified, how the windows will work, the capping system that we're putting in place. All of these things have been designed really to respond to the problems we had last year, where essentially we want to give as much information as we possibly can as early as we can. So the window doesn't open until June, but now we've got a lot of details out there to help farmers prepare. And what are the metrics of success? Well, one metric will be what is the uptake of these schemes amongst farmers. Actually, overall, ELM schemes have been very popular with farmers, and we hope the SFI 26 will be as popular. As we sit here now, I think there are over 40,000 farmers in SFI schemes. But also that feedback from the sector matters. So actually, on the back of last week's announcement, we got very positive feedback from the NFU, from CLA, not just about what we had announced, but the way in which we had engaged farmers and listened to the way they perceived the previous scheme. And indeed, some of the concerns they'd had about some possible reforms we were due to introduce, but actually did something slightly different in the end.
I spend a lot of my time going around the country, seeing NFU branches, local agricultural discussion groups, that sort of thing. I can't think of one time that I've done that where there has not at some point in the course of the evening had somebody say, but DEFRA as a department just isn't fit for purpose. You know, it's the way it's constituted, it should be broken up, it should be constituted differently, whatever it's going to be, it should be part of business and trade, you know, all sorts of different ideas. Does it worry you that the standing of the department within the agricultural industry is as low as it seems to be? And what are you going to do to turn it around?
Obviously, I don't agree with the idea that it's... I certainly agree there are things we need to get better, as I was alluding to earlier on, but I feel I've come into a department which is...
I mean, these aren't NFU politicians. These are sort of ordinary farmers in the community.
Yep.
And their interaction and their perception of the department is a poor one.
Yep.
Now, you've identified a lack of focus on outcomes, and undoubtedly that will be the case.
Yep.
So at the time when you closed SFI, with hindsight, really, the countryside stewardship schemes should have been dealt with at that stage. How much of that sort of thing are you going to be able to drive by way of change?
Well, I hope I will be able to change it. I mean, not just single-handedly, but this is a huge priority for the department as a whole. So one of the things we have been, I think, increasingly clear about over recent months is the degree to which having a sustainable, profitable, productive farming sector is a core outcome for all DEFRA. And actually, to some degree, I'm not sure that was entirely as clear as it should have been in the past. I think it is much clearer now. And I think the current Secretary of State has made that one of her top 4 priorities for the department, and the department is responding to that. I mean, the next steps in terms of that will be the first meeting of the new Farming and Food Partnership Board, which was one of the recommendations from Annette Patter's report. I think that will meet for the first time this month, and that is a genuine attempt to create a new forum for the department and the farming community and the food industry to work together to set out priorities and rebuild trust. I think another big test for us will be how the sector plans materialise. So we've committed to doing individual sector plans, initially with horticulture, secondary with poultry. Again, that will be a test of how well we work with the sector to rebuild their confidence. And
another test will be the implementation of Annette Patter's report. Now, you've talked about the board there, that's an important part. When will we get the government's, the department's response to the remainder of Minette's recommendations?
So to some degree, we're responding to individual recommendations as we go with individual announcements, but I think we will pull something together across the piece later this year.
Okay. You've recently got some publicity for your baseline training programme.
The Allerton project.
Talk us through the thinking behind that.
The thinking behind that is that I think in order to address some of the challenges you are raising, we need people in DEFRA who understand farming. There are people in DEFRA who understand farming. There are people in DEFRA who come from farming backgrounds. But it's never, I mean, in every department I've worked, it's never good enough. You want to get into the sector and understand the sector better than you do at any one point in time. So I think it's right that we invest in training and development for DEFRA staff. And one of the priorities for me is that people, particularly those who are working in the farming part of the department, know more about farming. So the funding we've put behind it costs about £150 per head for the people we are putting through. It's a mixture of online and then getting out onto farm to see it in practice. I think it's a really positive thing. It's been interesting to see how the debate has played out in the media about whether this is a complete waste of money. Often from the same people who say that DEFRA should know more about farming. So from my perspective, 150 quid a head is a pretty good investment into one of the more important areas. I should say it's not the only thing we do, though. DEFRA officials are out at all the agricultural shows, they're out at livestock markets, and actually I find generally the farming community is extremely generous in welcoming DEFRA officials on, not as part of a paid programme, and maybe it's because I'm the permanent secretary, but I've yet to see a farmer say no to me turning up at their farm, and I've been out on several already, and I've got a programme of further visits ahead, and I know that'll be true for lots of other officials as well. But I think within that overall approach, having a sort of formulated paid-for scheme is good value for money.
Yeah, I mean, the time spent at farms, time spent at agricultural shows, engaging with farmers, that's never wasted. You've done some of that. What about the rest of your colleagues? David?
Yeah, I've spent some time visiting farms in my time. Also, I am from a farming family, so I spent my summers worming
the mafia,
cows.
they never let you go.
They certainly don't. I think I am unique in the Exco team as someone who knows how to worm a cow.
Right. That's noted and could be brought back for future.
I have to confess I don't know how to worm a cow, but I grew up in a farming community. I'm from a small village in Cumbria, whilst not from a farming family, definitely very close to farming communities, and remember growing up through the foot and mouth crisis in Cumbria. I have spent some time in farms. I've been in DEFRA for 7 years now, but actually the majority of my time has been spent over recent years in the waste sector. So I have been looking at engaging with different parts of DEFRA's industry and stakeholder groups, but I think the same principle applies, which is getting out, know your stakeholders, know your industries, know your partners, and I think that applies across the board, including farming sectors.
Iain, it's maybe not so important for you, but have you got anything to add to this?
I've not been on an official farm visit. I live in a farming community, but that's the best I can offer you.
Right, okay. Well, let's just then look at one area where this might matter. I think there's a fairly broad consensus in the industry now that we have a looming animal welfare crisis this year in relation to the availability of New Zealand shearers or foreign shearers for shearing sheep. We think we might have 1.5 million sheep that there will not be available workforce to shear. What is DEFRA's contingency planning to deal with that animal welfare crisis when it hits?
I confess, Chair, I don't know what our plan is on that. I don't know if anybody on the panel does. We'll come back to you on that.
This is a significant problem.
Yeah.
It's one of the government's own making, because it's the Home Office who have refused visas for these 75 foreign shearers. Has there not been any discussion between DEFRA and the Home Office in this?
I suspect there has been conversations between DEFRA and the Home Office, and we talked to the Home Office a lot about the sort of issues you're describing. It hasn't hit my desk at this point. Maybe it's waiting for me when I get back, but I'm very happy to take a look at it and write to you.
Right, because that's a real and looming problem.
Yep.
And we can argue all the reasons about why we don't have sufficient shearers, and I know British Wool push people through training programmes all the time, but that's not going to be any comfort to the sheep who in July and August are still unsheared.
I agree with you, Chair, but if I can just pick up the sort of general point, I think, which is in that, as to how far does DEFRA champion the interests of farming across Whitehall when there are different Whitehall departments involved. I think we do that, and I think that we see that as one of our key jobs, in a sense, being part of the sort of industrial strategy for farming, which I think is the sort of essence of what Manette was asking for in her report, that DEFRA actually actively champions. So just give a couple of examples. We are in conversations at the moment, including with DESNES, about energy prices affecting the horticulture sector, an issue that has been raised with us by lots of farming representatives. We are currently consulting on planning reforms around farming, which is obviously an MHCLG lead, but again, that is in direct response to what we've been asked for by farmers, and I think that's been very welcome. So I can't give you the details on this specific case, but on the general point of, is DEFRA championing the interests of the sector with our departmental colleagues? We are.
To mixed effect, it would appear.
Say again?
To mixed effect, it would appear.
Well, let's see where we get to on those
What
issues.
I'm suggesting to you is that this is seen in the industry as a looming crisis. For whatever reason, and I think it might be interesting for you professionally to drill down into the reasons, it has not filtered up through the system to your desk, if indeed there is anything being done about it at all. Does that not really illustrate why the industry holds the rather poor view that it does of the department?
Well, I don't think you should judge how well the department's doing by what happens to hit my desk. I will go back to the department and work out what we are doing with that. We might be doing a very active programme of work engaging with communities affected. I don't know. So I will take a look at that and then try and form a judgment on your question.
Certainly in reading of the farming press, if you are doing anything, it's not filtering out, so there's a communications issue there. Look, just before I hand on to colleagues, a bit about your engagement with fishing communities. Yeah. Do you think you maybe have the same problem with the fishing communities that you have with farming industry? The non-departmental public bodies do not seem to be held in particularly high regard in the industry. We took the committee down to Brixham. Yeah. We were hearing there about the MMO not publishing their KPIs and their KPTs. Does that cause you some concern?
Of course, it's an area we need to improve on. I read your reports of your visit to Brixham. I recognise some of the issues that are in there. So, I mean, at the heart of some of that, I think, is just a recognition from the fishing fleet about the complexity of regulations that you're facing, the admin burden. I mean, I suppose what I'd say on that is fishing regulations are indeed extremely complicated. They're actually one of the more complicated areas I've been trying to get my head around as I've come into the organisation. I don't think there's a simple just a response to that, actually. I mean, to some degree, it is possible to simplify regulations in any areas as it is in fishing, but what you can tend to lose if you do that is some of the flexibility and the bespoking of regulations which the fishers themselves understandably want. We have also introduced the catch app, and that has had problems as well. So I recognise the picture that is being played back. I would say, though, that my experience of working with the director of Marine and Fisheries and his staff is that they recognise the picture, and B, they are responding to that. They are trying to be much more outwardly focused and engaged. They don't just do that through MMO, but I think MMO does have a very good, strong presence. We're about to announce a new chief executive of the MMO as well, so I'll definitely be able to take it up with them as a challenge. And what we've tried to do in the design of the new Fisheries and Coastal Growth Fund is exhibit a way of working which is very external, which is really looking for feedback and is co-designing with fishers. And I hope that has been well received.
So would that be the metric by which we judge you then when we're sitting here again this time next year, the Coastal Communities Growth Fund? Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, like, we want that to be a success. I feel confident it will be. I think we've engaged well with the sector. We put out some information about 2 weeks ago on the sort of areas that we'll cover. I expect and I hope we will get a very high take-up of applications.
Do we know when that will open for applications?
Sorry,
do we know when that will open for applications?
I don't have a date at this point now, but it'll be up and running for early in the new financial year.
For
early in the new financial year.
The new financial year. Okay, Josh, you wanted to come in on the question of some of the culture and trust issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for coming to speak to us this morning. I want to raise the issue of the importation of illegal products, particularly those of animal origin. We've received data from the Ashford Port Health Authority, which, as you all know, runs the Sevington Border Control Post, and that shows that in November of last year, nearly a fifth of consignments who were told to make the journey from Dover to Sevington didn't actually show up at Sevington. As a committee, we've previously expressed concerns that despite being our main port of entry, the arrangements between Dover and Sevington are a weak point in our border, and that those figures don't seem to allay those concerns, to be honest. And we've really struggled actually to get hold of this data. Initially, DEFRA told us that they would provide it, but then they realised that Ashford owned that data, and we had a lot of back and forth before they eventually sent it to us. So to the point of leadership, does this not smack of a major risk that DEFRA really hasn't got a grip of?
So perhaps if I say a few words and then ask Emma to pick it up, because this is her patch. So are we concerned about illegal products and illegal meat? Yes, we absolutely are. We recognise the risks that you're describing. I know this is an area the committee has done a lot of work on, which has been extremely helpful. I was down in Weybridge at the AFA headquarters last week. They made very clear to me they were worried about illegal meat. I think Emma and I are due to be down in Dover on the 22nd of April, so Emma and I can see for ourselves what is going on down there. So for reassurance, we are very focused on this, and we are building more capacity in the organisation to focus on it. Just on the data you talk about, and I'll hand over to Emma, who knows that data better. But two things to note in that data, and I don't want either of these things to sound complacent, but I want to just put it in a bit of perspective. So the first is that the data is improving over time in terms of the non-attendance rate.
Not on animal origin. It's gone back up on animal origin.
Okay.
So it's not a clear downward trend.
Okay.
That's what we're worried about.
Okay. Though I think you're describing monthly data, which presumably fluctuates a bit. But I think there is a downward trend, but Emma may correct me on that. The other thing is to say, just if the fact that they don't attend doesn't mean they're not checked. So the Port Authority is following up on those that don't attend. So neither of those things takes away from the central issue you're raising, which is this is a risk for us and something we're focused on. But I just want to put it in that perspective. But Emma, do you want to?
Thank you. Like Paul, I'm relatively new to role. This new Director General position was created about a month ago, and I think that is a reflection of the department's prioritisation of both EU reset, trade, and including the issues that you have just described, the creation of the additional senior capacity to focus on exactly these issues. I have studied your reports in depth and spoken to the teams working on this, both within DEFRA, but also working really closely with the Food Standards Agency, colleagues at the port, and I met yesterday with the Director General for Border Force, who's responsible for this, Phil Douglas, as well, because it's an incredibly important partnership there. I completely recognise your concerns about this being a really important issue that we absolutely need to prioritise and address. In terms of what we are doing about it, I would categorise that into sort of two phases of work. There is the work that we absolutely need to do now and progress immediately ahead of the anticipated new border arrangements that would come with the SPS agreement with the EU. And then there is looking ahead to what the arrangements need to look like once that SPS agreement is in force in the future. In the short term, I think there are four areas of work that we are progressing, and the first is exactly the issue you raise about improving the quality, but also what we do with the data we have. So I think this committee has quite rightly pointed out that there are inconsistencies and gaps in the information, and that data needs to be better utilised to understand the risks, but also target the enforcement activities to best effect. And that is exactly the conversation that I had with my Border Force counterpart yesterday about how we better bring together the different data sets held by at the border, but also in the communities if illegal meat is found in communities. So making sure that we've got that feedback loop as well, so that we are continuously improving the enforcement activity undertaken at the border. So we are progressing a piece of work both with Dover Port Authority and with Border Force colleagues to bring together those data sets to better effect and inform a much more targeted enforcement approach. And that's kind of step one priority. The step two priority is, as I say, what we do with it and how we improve our enforcement activity, the partnership at the border between Border Force and the Port Health Authority staff. Often, as my Border Force counterpart was describing yesterday, this isn't just about products of animal origin. This is often about vehicles that may be containing other illicit materials which are within Border Force's remit, whether it be tobacco, drugs and the like. So it's actually a much more rounded enforcement activity that needs to be undertaken, and that's the spirit of the conversation that I had with Mr. Douglas yesterday. The third element is how we fund that and how we support that activity at the border. We have already provided some additional funding in this financial year to Dover Port Authority to specifically target issues in relation to illegal meat. So we gave them just over £3 million in addition to their existing funding arrangements. And we are actively looking at further funding for 26-27, and that's a live discussion with ministers, and expect to provide details on that shortly. And the final element is, as I say, beyond the border. So how we work with the Food Standards Agency, their work with local authorities and with AFA. And there are two elements to that. The first element is really proactive communications into the industries and communities where we think these products may be going, so that they understand the health risks and can alert the authorities really actively as well. And the second is the work of the FSA-led Food Crime Unit, which is doing work in communities to identify these activities, seize the product, but also then, importantly, provide that feedback loop back to the border services so they can act on it and we can prevent it reaching communities in the future. That's the immediate action. we want to look beyond that and make sure that we are also preparing so that we've got the right arrangements in place under the new SPS agreement next year. That will obviously look different as we anticipate not having checks and controls for the majority of goods entering from the EU under that agreement. However, what we will have is much more active role and early role in decision shaping of new policies in the EU. We're seeking real-time access to their systems and databases to ensure that we can do much more sophisticated traceability and intelligence sharing, so again, enhancing that data piece. But also we are already working, so AFA and EU agencies are already working on how they can improve the input into the International Disease Monitoring Plus tool, so we're getting a more sophisticated readiness ahead of new arrangements from 2027. So completely recognise your concerns, and there is an active piece of work across agencies to try and address those issues urgently.
Do you think it's a growing problem?
I think it is very difficult to tell because of the data that has been identified, but regardless of the scale of the problem, I think it's a priority and we need to respond to it.
And can you give us assurances that post the SPS deal coming into force, obviously we don't know exactly what the detail of it's going to be, but our checks at the border will not be weaker than they are now?
Under the anticipated outcome, obviously, as you say, the negotiations are ongoing. The majority of product coming from the EU will not be subject to checks and controls. We will retain the ability, if there are specific biosecurity issues, as any member state would, to impose sort of local and regional arrangements. But the focus will shift onto how do we, using that real-time access to the EU's agency systems and databases, enhance our traceability activity. And that's activity that goes on across the EU already. So it will look different under the SPS agreement, but it will remain a priority and remain a critical issue as it is across the EU.
Most of these illegal imports are not coming through legitimate routes, and they're not coming through commercial channels either. They're coming through personal import lanes. So how does a deal on commercial products with the EU mean that we can take our foot off the gas when it comes to checks at the border?
I don't think it's about taking our foot off the gas. I think it's about adopting a different approach. You're absolutely right. We need to be wise to the fact that many of these products will be coming through as personal imports. But that's where, as I was discussing with Border Force yesterday, taking a more sort of holistic view of the range of criminal activities that we're talking about here. This is not an exclusively a meat issue. It's a criminal issue, and actually connecting it to the work that Border Force is doing on the range of criminal activities that are often connected with these consignments is a route into us having the intelligence about who do we need to track, who do we need to trace. The other side of it is what is the work of the FSA and AFA in communities, because actually knowing where the product goes, knowing who the customer is, and working with them so that they understand the risks, because as you say, often this meat is being transported in unhygienic conditions, should we say, working with them to sort of cut off the demand as well as cut off the supply has to be the sort of both ends of the equation to be addressed.
Are you going to be visiting Sevington? You mentioned you're going to Dover. Are you going to Sevington as well?
We're combining the two on the same day, and my senior team were in Sevington on Friday as well.
Just lastly, because I realise I've taken up quite a bit of time, Chair, we don't know yet whether there is data on what happens after non-attendances at Sevington. We know, as you said, there's a process of speaking to the local authority of the consignment's destination, but we don't know how successful that system is. We don't know how we can measure the success of that or otherwise. So would you support us in getting that information? And if it does raise concerns around potentially risky assignments slipping through the net, will you, Paul, personally look into that issue?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Do you have that information? You can give it to us.
We don't have that information at present. The question is, do we want to secure that information? Do we want to have better data on where all of the product is going and how it's being followed up? That's absolutely the spirit of the work that we're trying to do.
On the question of illegal meat imports, can I just be clear that I understood you properly there? You said it's not a food issue but a criminal issue.
It's not exclusively a food issue.
Yeah.
So Border Force were explaining yesterday that actually many of the consignments that they have identified, there may be other product in the vehicle not just meat. So actually for them, they're looking at it in terms of the full range of illicit activities that they are trying to enforce. And
as a criminal issue, how many successful prosecutions are there of those who have been identified as responsible for this?
I'm afraid I don't know how many prosecutions there have been.
As far as we've been told, there's none.
I know there have been a number of seizures recently. So, for example, the FSA-led National Food Crime Unit undertook a seizure recently, but that was in the community. But that, again, was based on intelligence sharing as well.
I mean, we've got foot and mouth in Cyprus now.
So just in terms of our response on foot and mouth, because I know actually, again, this committee has rightly challenged us on the speed of our response to the German foot and mouth. So I think we found out about foot and mouth in Cyprus on about 4 o'clock on the Friday afternoon on the 20th of February. We immediately communicated out to the ports. We had changed the IPAF system by first thing on the Monday morning. I think we'd actually changed the IPAF system before we got the formal notification through from the WRA.
Effective overnight,
yeah.
We've been told that.
Okay. So I think we're responding very rapidly, and there is nothing that we're describing which would prevent us.
Is there any targeting then of personal imports in relation to people coming back from Cyprus? Because that must be quite a substantial traffic.
So we've been working with the embassy in Cyprus as well to ensure that they are putting communications out to passengers. We've also been looking specifically at the types of movement of products of animal origin coming from Cyprus. The main product obviously being halloumi.
Which apparently doesn't carry foot and mouth.
Which doesn't carry foot and mouth. So actually the risk is relatively manageable in this case, but all the actions have been taken as Paul described.
Can I just come back to the general point of my response? So my answer is yes to, I will interrogate whatever data we can find, and we will pull together as much data as we possibly can, and if that's telling us a story we can draw intelligence from, we will act upon that.
And if the data is not available, does that not raise even greater concerns about the oversight that DEFRA's got on this issue?
Well, we'll keep pushing on the data and how we can merge lots of data together from the different agencies. It is a complex area because so many agencies are involved, but we will keep pushing it.
We have taken quite a lot of time in this, but it is important. Yeah, so, Charlie, policy, degrees and design.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for coming today. As a bit of a segue from the Chair's original questioning, I was speaking to a recently retired DEFRA official before your time, Mr. Kissack, no reflection on your tenure, and they described to me sort of a failure of strategic leadership in the sense there was a lack of joined-up approach across the department, where there was examples of very good working that sometimes wasn't recognised in the right way and that good practice wasn't shared, and sometimes where the department was failing, that was just allowed to continue. It was largely around silo working and of the culture, if you like. Is that a reflection that you would recognise from your 20 weeks so far?
Would I recognise it? So I definitely think there is a challenge for us in becoming, as I alluded to at the beginning, becoming more outcome focused. So really, really clear. What is DEFRA here to deliver? What are the outcomes we want to see? And who is responsible for which bits of that? We're a department, and obviously we can answer those questions across the piece, but we can answer them to varying degrees of strength and clarity, I think. And so to take a good example, the Environmental Improvement Plan that was published in December, I think is a much strengthened version of the previous plan. It sets out 10 goals. Each one of those is underpinned by a clear theory of change. Each one has an action plan with measurable targets. And that has been welcomed by the OEP as a significant strengthening on the previous one. We can therefore map who in which bits of the department are working towards individual outcomes. We can map it across Whitehall. We can map it with arm's length bodies. So it gives us a structure of clarity as like, this is the North Star that we are aiming for. This is everybody's individual contribution. To some degree, it weights those contributions, how important they are within the theory of change to what we're trying to achieve. For me, that is good discipline, but it is discipline that we apply to part of the department at the moment. I mean, the EIP is broad and it covers a lot of parts of the department, but it doesn't apply to everywhere. And so some of the work that I'm doing at the moment in terms of refreshing our outcomes framework for the whole of DEFRA is to try and bring greater clarity to that. On the issue of silo working, I mean, any department I've ever worked in, you know, you have teams who work to directors general, and some people describe those as silos and other people describe them as clear lines of command where you can get stuff done. And actually I tend to think of them as the latter. I want to make sure that everybody within the department is clear what they are meant to do and what they're being held to account for. And then we do have plenty of fora within DEFRA for bringing people together. So we have an environment board, which is leading the work on the EIP that I just mentioned, which will bring people together across all of the different Director General commands that are represented here and do more of that kind of cross-cutting work.
Yeah, and you mentioned the arms length bodies, 34 I think DEFRA has. Does that provide a challenge with accountability and responsibility in terms of delivering what you want to deliver from the department?
To a degree, but I wouldn't overstate it. So I think there's a bit of a narrative that it's very hard for DEFRA to deliver things because we have 34 arms length bodies. Well, I've never worked in a department which doesn't have arms length bodies, and I think we can overstate the complexity. And actually amongst those 34, they're very different sorts of arms length bodies. So you've got two, for example, large executive agencies in the RPA and the APHA. They are, to all intents and purposes, part of DEFRA. The length of the arm in those ALBs is a very short one. They are executive agencies. And then the other big ones like Natural England and the Environment Agency and MMO, in all of these cases, there is the opportunity for ministers to set out very, very clearly what we expect, what they expect, and therefore what we as a department expect from those agencies and to hold them to account. It is one of the things as I came in that we were definitely dialing up. Partly on the back of some advice we've been given by our lead non-executive director, Heather Hancock, who thought the way in which we were holding arm's length bodies to account was not as strong as it should be. So in my brief time in the department, I have sat in a number of meetings where the Secretary of State has held the Chief Executive and Chair of our larger arm's length bodies to account with follow-up actions and set out very clearly her expectations for what they should do. And we're due to augment that approach soon with new strategic policy statements, particularly for EA and NE, setting out, again, really, really clear, this is what we expect you to do, these are your priorities which we expect you to resource accordingly, and also actually this is how we want you to set your risk appetite. So to my earlier point about being focused on solutions and outcomes, that to some degree requires some of these bodies to take a higher approach to their risk appetite, and part of DEFRA's role, I think, is to give them the confidence they can do that.
I sort of welcome that approach, because I think there has been a failure in recent times to get a grip on the arms length bodies, and I think they've gone off and done what they think is what they should be doing and not necessarily being following the policy that you might want to deliver from the centre. In relation to sort of the recent unpredictability and delays of certain policy areas, farming schemes, packaging reforms, etc., how much has that been part of political decision-making, or is it a constraints of resource within the department to deliver on all of those things in a timely fashion?
So, I mean, slightly come back to me, I don't think we've been hanging around, to be honest. I mean, the new Secretary of State arrived in September. Since then, we've set out... I
appreciate it's probably before your time and the current Secretary of State's time, and when the SFI scheme, for example, closed, and we were promised we'd get it by last summer's recess, etc., and it was still, so you appreciate where that...
I do appreciate that.
Comes from,
so specifically on SFI, that was a conscious decision by ministers that given what had the new ministers, that given what had happened earlier in the year, the last thing they wanted to do was rush out a scheme that might be wrong. And they would rather take their time and get it right than get it fast. And we communicated that to the sector, and then we have engaged with the sector on how to shape that. And what you're seeing at the moment is that the Secretary of State and the Minister Eagle are setting out for the sector, bit by bit, piece by piece, how that SFI new offer is going to come together. So I definitely don't see that as a delay. I see that as ministers doing exactly what they said they would do, and that taking some time. I don't think it's about capacity. Could we go faster in the department? Marginally, perhaps, but that isn't the main constraint. The main constraint is taking ministers through the details of the scheme so they absolutely understand what risks we could be running through different decisions. And one of the key parts of this, going back to your earlier part of the question about ALBs, is the RPA is the key delivery agency. I've sat in meetings with the Secretary of State and Minister Eagle where they have had the policy director advising them on what policy decision to make, shaping the SFI, and then they turn to the Chief Executive of the RPA and say, tell us from RPA's perspective whether that is actually deliverable or which is higher and lower risk. That is really good practice, I think, so that we can have maximum confidence that as we do go live later this year, we have a set of proposals which not only are the right proposals from a policy perspective, but we have confidence in the deliverability of them as well.
And just in terms of the various policy streams and the pieces of work you're doing, take the land use framework, the farming roadmap, and you reference Baroness Batter's report to farm profitability. Now, that was commissioned in a short time frame and delivered quickly, and yet we are still waiting on the land use framework, the farming roadmap. All of those pieces of work are vital. They come together in order to deliver what Baroness Batters wants to see on the farm, and yet we are still waiting for two major strands of that. And so why are those being delayed, and yet we've managed to get Baroness Batters' report out before Christmas?
I don't recognise the word delayed for either of those. The farming roadmap will be the final piece. And again, Minister's been clear about that. They wanted the profitability review, they wanted to set out SFI, they wanted the land use framework, and then they wanted to move from that into the farming roadmap being the final piece. I hope we will see the land use framework very shortly. And we will see the farming roadmap a bit later this year, and this is the final piece, but we wanted to get all of those other bits in train as well. And just outside of the farming element specifically, it is, I think, worth noting that we've also published in December the water white paper. So in terms of ministerial capacity, moving from a standing start in September, they've also produced a white paper which is the most significant overhaul of the water system since the early 1990s. So again, I don't think we're hanging around.
I appreciate it, and it's, as I say, in some work streams you seem to be able to move very quickly, in others it seems to be very slow. I just maybe pin you down a little bit more on when we might see the land use framework very shortly. Can you put a season on it? I mean, are we,
I would
spring, summer, autumn.
Let me put an emphasis on it and say very shortly.
Very shortly. Excellent. Well, we look forward to that in due course. Just on a brief point of detail on the SFI, how are you going to ensure that we don't get a repeat of what happened last time and a sudden closure of the new scheme?
Yeah, so I think the main lessons to learn are that the big thing we lost in the last, and why we did lose trust of farmers, is we closed it unexpectedly and suddenly. And actually part of what we need to be able to do is communicate regularly how much of the budget is being used up. So at the point we go live with the window, we will be able to communicate much more information about the size of the budget available, and then we'll be able to provide more of a running commentary actually on how much of the budget is being used up, so that the farming community can look at that and realise, because there will come a point where we do have to close the window, but we want to do that in an orderly way. The other aspect, which I think caused significant problems last time round, is we closed the window. We then realised we had previously communicated something which to those who'd already started, and then we had to reopen. Some of that, I think, comes down to much clearer and closer working between the department and the RPA. And as I was just describing earlier, we have been working hand in glove with the RPA. So that's why I have a level of confidence we won't have a repeat.
Thank you very much.
So, can I just probe you gently here in relation to, I think you said you don't recognise the term delay in relation to the land use framework and the farming roadmap. They were both promised last year, and we're pretty near the end of Q1 this year.
Yep.
Now, I mean, I'm the West Highlander in the room here. Punctuality is not always my strongest suit. But if you don't recognise it as delay, what would you call it?
Well, I would say that a new set of ministers arrived in September and made some very deliberate decisions about when they were going to put out a set of documents they were being expected to publish. And then they said, the other side of Christmas, before Christmas, they set out publicly when they wanted to publish those documents. And we have published every one of those documents in line with what they said they would do.
So it's not delay, it's just a reordered timetable, then. Is that what Sir Humphrey would call it? At the end of the day, though, the point is it's probably going to be the guts of 2 years into a 5-year parliament before the department has come up with any sort of strategic direction for the industry. And in the meantime, things like the SFI tactics are being formulated without any idea of what the overall strategy is and what the industry is expecting of government.
I'm not sure I'd accept that, to be honest, Chair. So the farming roadmap will be the point at the end of the process where we pull it all together. In the meantime, we are starting to set out different elements over time. That's not just about SFI, actually. I mean, one of the announcements the Secretary of State made last week was about capital investments, 345 million of capital investments in ELM and in innovation grants. She set out policies around farming collaboratives.
Your predecessor had. This is exactly the problem we had with your predecessor. You've got various initiatives here, there and everywhere. This was why we called our report the Vision for Farming. You're coming up with these various initiatives, some of which connect up with each other, but you've got no overarching strategy, so you don't know where they fit into the picture.
I wouldn't agree with that. I challenge anybody to read the Secretary of State's speech from the NFU conference last week and say we do not have an emerging strategy, because we do. It is coming together, and it will finally come together.
It's an emerging strategy that you're late in publishing and that nobody's yet seen.
Well, the bit of the strategy, which is the farming roadmap, will be published later this year. In the meantime, we will also be publishing sector strategies as well, sector growth plans, starting with horticulture and poultry. So we are, piece by piece, pulling together a much clearer vision for farming in this country.
In every other organisation I've ever known, you get the strategy first and then the tactics, but DEFRA seems to think it's sensible to do the other way around. Charlie, you wanted to pick up.
I was just going to make that point. Surely the roadmap should have come first,
no,
and everything else.
No, ministers have been very clear the roadmap will be the thing that comes last.
Ministers might be clear, but are they right?
Yes.
So you think it's sensible to have tactics before you have a strategy?
I've worked in lots of policy areas over 20 years, and I would say...
Is this possibly why DEFRA's the state that it is, then?
I don't reckon. So it's perfectly possible to put out an early document. The earlier it comes, the lighter it will tend to be in details, and people will say this is all very well, but we need more detail. By doing a document that pulls together lots of detail. But there's a choice to be made here, and it's a perfectly sensible choice to start setting out elements of the forward strategy and then pulling the whole thing together into a single story later in the year. I think it's a perfectly reasonable choice.
Okay, that's an interesting view. You finished, John? Right, Terry, DEFRA staffing.
Lovely, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to ask a few questions on staffing, if I may. I think it's fair to say there's been various waves of cuts to DEFRA. I mean, my predecessor rather famously made several cuts in the past. And there's been an 8% headcount reduction since July 24, a further planned 5% reduction this financial year. And I wanted to ask how confident you are that the department will actually be able to meet its statutory responsibilities, given what is quite a significant reduction in staffing.
Yeah, and actually, just on those numbers, so I think the overall reduction we've seen since March 24 is now about 15%. But yes, I am confident. So what the overall story here is that at the spending review, like other departments, we were given particular savings trajectories you had to make. I think we have a 10% administrative savings cut to reach. I think about 2/3 of our administrative costs as a department are staffing. So it's inevitable that we will be looking to reduce our staffing. I think at the time of the spending review, we were going from sort of 7,300, which was the sort of March 2024 figure, down to, by March 2029, 5,800. So that's a reduction of about 21%, 1,500 people. So that's the overall context across the spending review period. We made some very early progress on that. Which is the 15% reduction from March 2024 to where we were at the end of 2025. That was a deliberate decision made at the time to make early progress towards a reduction we knew we would need to make, and also potentially to provide a bit of headroom to bring new skills into the department while still remaining on that trajectory. So that's why that was a deliberate approach to reduce headcount. In fact, it was supported by a voluntary exit scheme through which about 300 people left as well. Since then, and around about sort of summer last year, where we signed the common understanding with the EU, and we also received the John Cunliffe report on the water reforms, we identified that we have time-limited but quite significant pressures in those two areas. So as we sit here now, we are actually in the process of rebuilding staffing in those two areas in particular. So we have reprioritised staff across the department into those two areas, and we are continuing to recruit into vacancies in those two areas. So as we sit here now, we are increasing, albeit into time-limited roles, to get through the EU reset work and the front end of the water reforms. It is still at the moment the objective to get back to that SR trajectory that I described at the beginning by the end of the Parliament.
Okay. So underneath those sort of headline figures of the actual numbers, I think of even greater concern for me is the change in experience and skills. So increasingly in many, well, in your department, but also in some of the arm's length bodies, we've seen a loss of very experienced and competent staff. Farmers are very honest people, and they tell me repeatedly how when a DEFRA official turns up, it's the farmer normally that tells them what they need to be doing, which is of huge concern to me, to be honest with you. So how are you ensuring that amongst the staff that you have remaining, there are the right skills and perhaps more importantly the experience, because there needs to be a balance? How are you ensuring that mix is there?
So it's an ongoing challenge that any department, any organisational leader would have, and each ALB has its own particular challenges in the way that you're describing. I think, to go back to the voluntary exit scheme that we had, we turned down 240 people who applied for the voluntary exit scheme for those kind of reasons, actually. We were basically like, no, we need this person with this skill, this knowledge within the organisation. The people we let go, we made a judgment that actually there is an opportunity there to be on our downward trajectory and bring in the sort of new skills that we need. I mean, the skills that the department needs, some of them are continuous, and certainly the deep knowledge you're describing there will always be a requirement for. But some of our skills needs are changing, and actually to meet some of our efficiency targets, which I mentioned right at the beginning, we need more data skills, more digital skills. So those are some of the areas we are looking to bring in. And even within the two priority policy areas that Emma and David lead, there is a particular emphasis on bringing in a set of skills around data and digital and project management to some degree. So we do need to, like any organisation, we need to replenish our skill base over time. One thing I wouldn't want to leave you is an impression that sort of DEFRA has become, we do have challenges with staff engagement at DEFRA, I'm not going to hide from that. So the latest civil service people survey results, which actually came out earlier this week, are really disappointing for DEFRA. We went backwards in terms of the overall staff engagement scores in 2025. We are now, I think, about 5 percentage points behind the civil service benchmark. That is definitely not where we want to be. At the same time, thousands of people apply to join DEFRA. So I think in October last year we had nearly 5,000 people applying to join DEFRA to new roles. I think this month and last we will be onboarding 300 people into DEFRA. So in that sense we do not have a problem with attracting people to come in and work in DEFRA, given the nature of the work that we do. Our turnover rate, I think our turnover rate is actually about 13.7 at the moment, but that compares to a sort of long-running norm of about 12%, and the 13.7 is influenced by the voluntary exit scheme. So I'm looking at those numbers, and I'm not alarmed by the turnover rate, though I'd like to bring it down. I am very worried about the staff engagement level, and I want to bring that up. And then in terms of our overall staffing numbers, the priority right now is to try and bring more people into the organisation to build up the areas that have got immediate pressures.
May I just add a point on skills retention, because I think your challenge is a very pertinent one, and we are in a competitive market with other departments, other agencies, other bits of the public sector. We have some limited flexibility around our remuneration and retention policies, so we have sought, where we identify particular skill requirements, we have sought to identify sort of certain premiums that we would pay. We've applied that, for example, to certain scientific roles, certain veterinary officer roles, also on certain resilience and national security functions. Again, we've applied it there. So where we have that pay flexibility, we're using that as part of a targeted recruitment and retention strategy.
Okay, thank you. I will come back to the point about retention. I've got a separate point. But Paul, you mentioned recruitment, and the Chair mentioned earlier about the baseline agricultural training. I've spent a number of weeks defending that to a number of farmers, because I agree with you that we want DEFRA staff to be knowledgeable about farming. But unless we're going to be repeating that training year after year, because if you have a turnover, you'll have to repeat the training to new staff. Are you reviewing your recruitment processes? Because presumably you would want to recruit people with that knowledge in the first place. Is there a barrier? Are we ever going to move away from recruiting people solely, that don't have that knowledge in the first place?
Well, we recruit for the skills of the job. And generally speaking, when we're recruiting into DEFRA, we'll be recruiting people who could in theory work in a number of different areas of policy. So most people in DEFRA for a prolonged period of time, including the people on this panel, will have worked in multiple parts of the organisation. So that means we tend not to be recruiting for a specific set of background knowledge, but we obviously do prize background farming knowledge or fisheries knowledge or environmental knowledge if that is what somebody brings into the organisation. I think one thing I'd say, which I personally feel quite strongly about, is that we also need to make sure we are building up our policy capability outside of London. Yes. I happen to be formerly based in York. I think I'm the first Perm Sec not to be of a ministerial department not to be based in London, so I split my time between North Yorkshire and London. We have policy hubs in Newcastle, York and Bristol that I think allows us to reach into a different demographic as well, different catchment. So I'm all for building up those skills. And most of the arm's length bodies have a really broad geographical catchment as well. So MMO is all around the coast. The Environment Agency is all over the country. So we have lots of opportunity to bring people in from different backgrounds into our work. I don't have any immediate plans to sort of pivot our recruitment approach into particular areas of knowledge. There will be certain jobs where we do require a particular knowledge. I would rather be bringing people in the department who have a passion for the work that we do, wherever that passion comes from, and that we sort of, we fulfil their passion by giving them really interesting and useful work and also get them out onto farm. I think Minette's phrase was she wants to see more civil servants in the lambing shed. I don't know whether farmers really want to see that.
There's a demand, we've heard.
Well, I confess, much to my office's annoyance, I have taken her at her word, and I will be in a lambing shed either next week or the week after. Whether the farmer wants me there, I don't know. No doubt they'll tell me afterwards.
Whether the lamb wants you there. I just wanted to go back to your point around changes in priorities, because you quite rightly, recognise that there has been a shift. Water, SPS must be. Well, we know your officials have confirmed that they're consuming resources. What aspects of DEFRA's work are you not staffing as well as you would like? Where are those staff coming from? Where are the gaps?
Yeah, so I should say there are 4 priorities for the department. You mentioned 2, so e-reset and water, and those 2 in particular are the ones which are drawing in new staffing at the moment. These are, there is a time-limited element where we just need a lot of staff in those areas to get through the sort of front end of the reforms that we are taking forward. The third area is around farming. I don't think we have big gaps in our farming directorate, which is why, whilst we might disagree on delays or not delays, we are getting on with stuff in the Farming Directorate, and I have confidence in the capacity that we have there. The 4th priority area for the Secretary of State is around restoring nature and environmental planning and the interaction with the wider planning system, and sort of how do we support infrastructure development, including housing, whilst also delivering a win-win for nature. Again, I think that is currently well-resourced, and actually we've restructured in order to put more weight behind that. You're right, though, we have moved people from other areas. We have detailed conversations line by line with ministers about areas where we might either stop or pause or pivot away or possibly be able to do things slightly more efficiently. So it's not as straightforward as we just stop doing various things.
Give me some examples of where they've come from.
Yeah, so things that we have stopped, for example, so the Northern Ireland team has now been folded into, because that's a pivot for them. We are closing the NOx programme because that has sort of come to the end of its time. We've reduced the central comms budget. We've closed down an international strategy team that was sitting at the centre of the department. We have slowed down some aspects of animal welfare work, but not all aspects. We've slowed down or paused some elements of the work that we're doing within biosecurity, but not the areas where we think are highest risk. So it's a long and complicated picture, but we are definitely sort of dialing down in certain areas. I think the overall resulting sort of vacancy rate across different areas is about 5%. But there are not areas of the department which I'm looking at thinking that's a big priority area. We've got a lot of work to do. We don't have enough people, actually, with the exception of Emma's area and David's area, as I say, where we're recruiting in.
Okay, thank you. And then just finally, Chair, on the retention point from earlier, I mean, it is of huge concern around staff morale, and sort of looking at some of the figures, and certainly from our own conversations with officials around morale, and that contributes to turnover, as does pay. Could you just confirm and sort of reiterate maybe what you are doing to retain good staff and address some of those concerns about morale? It's not all about pay. I'm sure that would be a big part of it, but you know, what else is going on to actually retain the staff that we've got, especially if you're spending significant sums now training them?
Yeah, so you're right, it's not all about pay, but pay is an issue. Slightly curiously, of the, I think, 8 different subcategories within the later civil service results, for DEFRA, pay was the single one that got better in terms of people's views of the department. There are 3 things we've decided as an ExCo we need to respond to in terms of the staff survey results. So one is around the purpose of the organisation. So one of the areas we score relatively poorly on is people feeling a strong sense of connection to the purpose of the organisation and knowing what we are here for. Now, one thing I would say is that it's actually quite hard for DEFRA compared with most other organisations I've worked in, because we cover so many different things. But that, I think, is a reason to work harder at telling the story and being proud in the contribution we make. It's where I started. We're an economic department, a national security department, a science department. We are a serious player in government, and people should feel proud to work at DEFRA. I don't think they always do. I don't think they always tell that story as convincingly as we should. So a lot of the work I'm doing myself at the moment around that and around our outcomes framework is to try and instill a stronger sense of connection to purpose. I think that's really important to people's sense of engagement. People in public service come to work because they want to make a difference and they want to see what they're making a difference to. So that's the first of the 3. The second is around line management. In my experience, if you are unhappy with your line management, even if everything else in the organisation seems fine, you are unhappy at work. And good line managers get the best out of people. They train them, they develop them, they coach them, and they make them feel part of the organisation. And so actually getting back to some good basics on what line management looks like within the department. That's the second priority. And the third actually is around development. Some of that may be about formal training, but we're not going to send everybody out onto a farm. A lot of it is actually just about having a good conversation with people about where they want to go in their careers and how we can support them in lots of different ways, how we can move them into work that stretches them and supports them to do that. So those 3 things, focus on purpose, good line management, and careers and development, they're the 3 things we're focused on.
We're going to see those figures improve over the coming years around morale and retention.
Certainly hope so.
Thank you.
Good luck in the lambing shed. Don't spend all your CPD time in the lambing shed, though. We may need you come shearing time. So, just bear that in mind. Henry,
I really don't think you would want me shearing a sheep.
You've got some questions around resourcing and priorities.
Yeah, no, thank you, Chair. I mean, I'm conscious that you've touched on a lot of things already, but you've got a big agenda for change. I mean, we touched on the water in terms of the biggest overhaul of the water sector since the 90s. We've got the EU in respect to the SBS agreement. I think we had evidence from the FSA there was some sort of 300 pieces of legislation that might be included in terms of part of that dynamic alignment and reset with the European Union. The Veterinary Surgeons Act, reforming that. You've touched on the Environmental Improvement Plan. I do note that I think we've got the Office of Environmental Protection said that you remain off track to meet your environmental outcomes. So I guess the question is your capacity to deliver and your assessment of that capacity and what your key risks are in that context.
Yeah. So, I think the department got a good spending review settlement in the context of a very difficult fiscal position. I think DEFRA came out well from the spending review. We've got about 7.5 billion DEL each year. That allows us to ensure that on average 2.3 billion is going to farmers, and actually more of it will go to farmers through some of the nature funding as well.
Wait, on your savings, you've got a technical efficiency of 1%, then you've got a real terms budget reduction of 6.5%.
Say again?
So in terms of your departmental spending, you had to make technical savings of at least 1% of annual day-to-day spending.
Yep. And
then you have your spending is set to fall in real terms of 6.5%.
So what we have to do is we have to deliver £485 million of savings by 28-29. 460 of those were agreed at the time of the spending review, and then actually there was an additional 24 added on in the budget statement last year. Of those, on Ardell, about 300 will just be a reduction in Ardell spend because we're just stopping spending on things. So things like the Northern Ireland programme, the NO2 programme, actually quite a big chunk of it is as we dial down basic payments. So within ELMS, what is happening is we are dialing down basic payments, we are dialing up other elements in ELMS, and quite often they are capital rather than revenue. So what you're seeing is a revenue to capital switch, but it means our revenue, our Ardell comes down in total by about 300 million. We've then got about 120 million of technical efficiencies. So this is lowering input costs but delivering the same output costs. And we've got programme work with ALBs around that. A lot of that is driven by digitising services and AI. And then we've also got some increased cost recovery, probably about 30 million. So but putting those three things together, that's how we get to about 485. So we are working on plans for all of those things to be able to deliver our savings target. And so we're confident we can deliver that, and with the funding that we do have, deliver the priorities that we've been given by the government. On the EIP that you mentioned, or whether we are off track, I mean, it is certainly the case that from what we know at the moment, it is mixed in terms of our performance and our trajectories towards the EIP targets. But what we did in December is we set out a new set of interim targets. We are confident that they are realistic, smart targets as interim targets, and that we have designed our funding to meet those. The most important element of that funding is actually ELMS. So it is the work that we are doing through farmers and landowners through the ELMS programme that helps deliver, I think, 13 different EIP targets. So that is protecting the ELMS budget and making the best use of that is probably our single most important intervention within EIP as well.
You know, I mean, so we talked about the reputation of DEFRA. Do you not think that there's an element that you're being asked to do more for less, which means that your tangible delivery on the ground, I mean, are you not overwhelming the department? I mean, the Minister Eagle told us, I think, on the SBS that there's a massive capacity issue in the department. I mean, is that part of the problem which reflects the Chair's comments at the beginning of the session?
So there is a big capacity problem or challenge within the department on SBS. That's why I think one of the first things I did was decide we needed a group dedicated to EU Reset, appointed a new Director General who is now recruiting more people in. I think there are about 500 people in the department working on Reset as we sit here today. I think we're in the process of recruiting in another 200. We got additional funding from the Treasury specifically in order to do that, in addition to the spending review settlement, recognising this new pressure had come along. Are we trying to do too much? Well, part of the discipline, and going back to the earlier question, is you have to find areas of work that you can sort of dial down, pause, pivot away from. What you can't be doing is asking people to achieve the same amount of work with fewer people working on it. There are always areas where you can gain efficiencies and do a bit of that, but overall we have to have the discipline to actually say, we're going to stop doing that work or we're going to pause that. So that's part of what the good leadership of the department looks like. I've been very pleased that we have a set of ministers who will happily sit in a room and give us those steers and say, okay, we accept the risk, but we're going to stop doing that because we need to prioritise our resources into these areas. So I'm like, it's always a work in progress, right? Every week we have conversations as a top team about where we might need to move resources around, where pressures are being felt, and what we do about it. But that's the nature of the job.
Are you confident on parliamentary time in terms of being able to deliver all these major reforms? In terms of getting that
parliamentary time is rather out of my hands.
But in terms of those are discussions that will be ongoing within the department. You're flagging these concerns.
Yeah. So I might come to Emma, particularly on the EU Reset side. Obviously, the other big commitment we have in terms of parliamentary time is around the water white paper, the water bill.
So certainly on EU Reset, you're absolutely right. There is a huge legislative requirement that flows from that. I have to say, we are probably, the department has responded fantastically to this, and a really strong team who has pretty extensive experience of delivering major secondary legislation programmes has come together to develop what I consider to be a credible plan to progress that legislation, working in partnership with the Food Standards Agency, as you described, who are also progressing legislation that is their lead, but we are working together on that overall programme of legislation. And they are working with the Cabinet Office and with the Chief Whip's office to ensure that we are navigating and being fully transparent about the parliamentary time requirements connected to that. As the Permanent Secretary says, that's somewhat out of our gift, but in terms of is the scale of the task understood? Absolutely. Is it seen as a priority for the government as a whole? Absolutely. So I'm confident we are doing everything in our gift to progress that work.
I don't know whether you wanted to comment on the water, in terms of the position from the department on gaining parliamentary time or resourcing.
So obviously I can't preempt the King's speech, but suffice to say, in terms of the precise timing of the water bill, but suffice to say we are significantly scaling up our resourcing to be ready to have legislation to introduce. To give you a sort of sense of the scale of that, our staffing supporting all water functions, all flood and water functions, has grown by about 90 people since the start of this financial year, and in business planning we plan to increase by a further 90 next year, and we're in the process of scaling those teams up. We've also significantly strengthened the senior structure, 5 additional deputy directors in the team, and we're adding a further director precisely to lead on the big water reform. So I feel, whilst we still have some gaps we're plugging, I feel in terms of resourcing that, we have a good plan in place. More broadly, on your question about legislative time, we have just completed quite an extensive exercise with the whole ministerial team, taking account of, in particular, the demands of the EU work, to go through our entire secondary legislative programme for the next couple of years and work out precisely how we will prioritise time-critical EU reset secondary legislation, other critical pieces of secondary legislation we need to bring forward. We're giving particular priority, for example, on your point about resourcing, to bring forward SIs that also allow us to levy fees and charges in certain areas of our business, because not all of our funding comes from grant and aid. So I feel like we've got a good sized plan for secondary legislation that we're in a position to bring forward. And if things slip, we've also got a kind of watch list of other things we could further accelerate. And that's important, looking not just for this session, but looking further ahead, so that, for example, when we do get to the Veterinary Services Act bill, for example, we, with our legal team, are planning about when we can release our legal resource from current plans onto future legislation as well.
Thank you. Can I finally, Chair, can I just ask, do you, we touched on resourcing priorities, you talked to Terry as well. I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, DEFRA has more arm's length bodies than any other department in terms of the amount of arm's length. You've got sort of like 35 arm's length bodies?
34, I think.
34.
Yeah.
Do you think you get value for money from those arm's length bodies? And given your, the resource constraints, the decisions you're having to make on a day-to-day basis to try and push funding resources into these priorities that's set by government, do you think that many arm's length bodies is maybe something you'd review, something that concerns you? The question is, do you think you get value for 35 arm length bodies? 34, sorry.
Make more. I might ask David to come in because he's been overseeing our ALB reform programme. But I suppose the thing I would say is, just in overall terms, is the challenge I set out at the beginning about how we need to become more efficient and more outcome focused as a department applies just as much to our arm's length bodies. I don't mean that in a deficit or critical way about the work they do. I think if you look at the performance of our arm's length bodies over recent years, there are plenty of areas we could point to where they are getting better, including in terms of their customer service, their ability to sort of respond. I think the Environment Agency is now hitting 95% timeliness around planning for the first time since about 2018. There's plenty of things we can point to where those arm's length bodies are delivering better. But the efficiency challenge, the productivity challenge sits as much with them as it does with us. quite a lot of our digital investments that we'll be making as a result of our SR25 will be in our arm's length bodies. So we have a big IT program going on in the Environment Agency at the moment, the Regulatory Services program. There's a very big one which is due to be run through the APHA. Our RPA IT is one of, well, actually, it's one of those bits which is a risk for the departments, one of our business critical systems. One of the things, actually, going back to an early part of the conversation, where we've been very careful that we're not trying to go too fast on aspects of SFI in a way that our IT system couldn't cope, but we are beginning to test a new IT system. So quite a lot of the answer to ALB efficiency and productivity will come through our digital work. But David, do you want to?
Yeah, a couple of things just to add to that. Firstly, I mean, on that headline 34 number, worth just reiterating the point made earlier that that covers a very, very diverse range of organisations, from Environment Agency, 13,500 people, to 10 of them are national park authorities, for example, which sort of technically score against us. Some of them are tiny expert scientific committees with very, very few people attached to them. I think on your question about efficiency and value for money, one thing just to bear in mind is I think DEFRA is pretty unique in government in already having consolidated our back office functions for many of our arm's length bodies, so our IT, our finance functions, our commercial functions. So we've already brought those together in one place, and that has driven, I think, something of the order of magnitude of about 500 million of savings since that model was introduced a few years ago. But I think we're always looking at is our arm's length body landscape efficient and effective? And in fact, ministers reached the conclusion in respect of an area like water that change is needed. And so we are bringing together the water functions of 4 different organisations into a single integrated environmental regulator. That's principally about the effectiveness of those organisations to deliver good outcomes in the water sector. So where there's a sort of strong case for institutional change, we're absolutely doing that, and those water changes will be addressed in the water bill. It'll be one of the biggest sort of changes to the DEFRA arm's length body landscape that we've seen for many years. Beyond that, though, I think that there is a real interest and appetite in how do we get arm's length bodies working more effectively together. Many of our arm's length bodies they're often present in the same places around the country, and so that's why we're following the review from Dan Corrie, that's why we're experimenting things with innovations like lead regulator pilots, where one of our arm's length bodies is taking the lead on working with a big scheme or a big project on behalf of others, so that scheme or project has a single front door, really, to all of the different environmental regulators they need to work with. So, for example, we're piloting that with the Falmouth Docks scheme, and we've got some more that we're about to announce. So, in a way, however you cut the institutional landscape, one of the things we really want to do is make sure that our bodies are offering a more seamless service to the businesses and the communities that they're serving.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, well, we shall see where you get to with the parliamentary time for that. It's a massive piece of work, the SPS implementation. 700 officials, Emma. The implications for this, of course, will not just be felt within DEFRA. The devolved administrations will also have to beef up their operations. Are you supporting them in that? Because you can go to Treasury and you say, I need extra resource. Are they doing the same?
So we're working very closely with the devolved governments, both at a working level where they are a sort of an integrated part of both the day-to-day project teams, the governance, but also at a ministerial level. So Minister Eagle meets with her counterparts monthly to talk about the SPS agreement and ensure that we are engaging them both in the negotiations process but also in the preparation of the legislation and implementation as you describe. On our approach to in terms of resourcing, as Permanent Secretary described, we have had some additional support this year from the Treasury, and the devolved governments are liaising with the Treasury directly on their resource requirements. But obviously we have shared the nature of the work and the scope of the work, and we will continue to work with them as we plan that out. But it's been a very collaborative process and will continue to be so.
I certainly hope so. Juliette, you're going to take us through some additional capacity issues.
Thank you, Chair. Just thinking about resources and the capacity for managing threats, DEFRA has got a broad portfolio across emergency responses. Could you tell us a little bit about what resources are available for emergency responses, including environmental recovery from CBRN events?
Yes, and I might actually ask David to take us through that, if that's okay.
Yeah, happy to. So on your specific question about CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear, we have a dedicated standing team that leads on our responsibilities in respect of recovery from CBRN incidents. That team also leads on our emergency response to flood emergency and water supply emergency. So we have a dedicated standing team for that. We have relationships with certain other agencies across government that provide technical support to some of those CBRN recovery programs. We have a relationship with DTSL, for example. In addition, we have a number of different reserve capabilities that allow us to surge in respect of when incidents arise. We have three different capabilities that I might just touch on, and then we're building a fourth, which I'll refer to. So specifically on flood, water supply or CBRN recovery, we have an emergency reserve of around 146 staff. They work elsewhere in the department, but they can be drawn down with immediate effect if we need to scale up or stand up an emergency response. For example, they were most recently used in response to Storm Chandra in January, and also some of the response to some of the water supply disruption that we saw in the southeast of England. My head of CBRN emergencies, he makes the judgment call in consultation with me on whether we draw those people down. We also have what we call our response reserve, trained staff across the department, and they offer more of a flexible operational or policy or analytical response, which can be to a range of unforeseen incidents. So as examples, in the first quarter of last year, some of those staff were deployed actually to help with the FMD outbreak we saw in Germany. We put some of those staff to support our standing teams on animal welfare to do contingency planning about a pre-outbreak response here in the UK. Thankfully, we didn't call on all of that, but we deployed them there. And my resilience director, who works for me, she decides on the deployment of those staff. We have a further dedicated reserve of 23 staff who are available for contingency planning in the event of a national power outage. We've never deployed them, I'm pleased to say, but we concluded, following certain exercises across government, that we needed to be confident we had dedicated staff who we could deploy, who had easy access to certain locations with secure power and emergency communications in the event of a national power outage. Over and above all of that, we are working to refresh, in effect, mutual aid arrangements across our four largest arm's length bodies. So that's the Environment Agency, APHA, RPA, and Natural England. We've agreed in this in principle, but we just need to formalise the final details of this. But this will be, in effect, a mutual aid arrangement whereby the chief execs of those organisations, should they be incapable of responding to an incident with their own resources, can call on others to draw down up to 3% of their total staff. So that's quite a significant pool across the DEFRA group. We've tested elements of that in exercise Pegasus, which was the Tier 1 exercise, cross-government exercise rehearsing for a major zoonotic pandemic just before Christmas. So we've tested elements of that, and we should be able to finalise those arrangements in the coming weeks. And then finally, I would just add that that's what we can do with our own resources, but we also do have access to other capabilities elsewhere in government. There's an HMRC surge team that we're able to draw down upon should we need to do so, and we also have certain arrangements in place with the armed forces, in particular in respect of flood.
Want to add anything? Okay. I just wanted to go a little bit further on that, just thinking about concurrent emergencies. So it looks like there's a lot of contingency planned. How prepared do you think that DEFRA is to manage or handle concurrent emergencies?
So I think many of the things I've described are really about giving us some additional surge capability to do precisely that. To a degree, we've actually been handling certain, for example, we've handled concurrent animal disease outbreaks over the last year or so. What I think we're trying to do is take a more strategic approach to all aspects of our resilience planning. So we have a dedicated resilience director, we have a resilience board that I chair that brings together all of the different bits of the department that could conceivably face a kind of emergency response, and some of what I've described, having ring-fenced capabilities of named reserves who we're confident we can draw down on, is to make sure that we think we can address concurrent emergencies. Obviously, we plan for the worst as well, so I would say some of our capabilities have been tested in relatively sort of moderate incidents in recent years, but clearly one of the things we do plan for is worst case scenarios, and that's where some of the additional resources across government that I described might come into play.
I think the only thing I'd add is just context for your question. It is a risk for us. I mean, we can increase our approach to resourcing, we can improve our overall governance of this. The reality is there is a risk around concurrent outbreaks, and if there is a significant scale, it would really test the APHA and others, depending on what the issue was. There was a PAC hearing, there was an NAO report on this last year, which recognised that as a risk, and it is one of the elements which is quite high up our corporate risk register. So, the context for your question, I understand it is a risk, but it's one that I think we are, as David says, taking action to manage as best we can.
Thank you. Chair, I've got one more question. I'm particularly interested in flooding. So I wanted to ask you about the major capital commitment in flood defences that you're currently overseeing. So there are 52,000 properties that you would be able to better protect by the end of this month. Mm-hmm. And also looking at an additional 14,500 properties that are expected to have better levels of protection. Can you just tell us how many of these properties are now better protected from the dangers of flooding?
Yeah. I'll look to David again on this one.
That. So the 52,000 figure that you cited, that's right. That's the target for properties better protected through the 2 years of the flood programme that conclude at the end of this month. So we haven't yet got the final outturn for the full year, obviously. We were at 47,500 better protected in December. And what I would say is, working with the Environment Agency, we're very, very confident that 52,000 figure will be achieved when we see the final outturn at the end of this month. I think that the 14,000 figure that you referred to, I think, was the steps taken to reprioritise an element of the overall flood budget into the maintenance of critical flood assets. We have seen a declining profile in the proportion of critical flood assets in good condition, and so ministers have set a target to turn that around, and so we reallocated around 108 million, I think it is from memory, to additionally support asset maintenance. And so that's what that figure, I think, refers to. Going forward, as I'm sure you're aware, we recently announced some changes to the flood funding rules, which will apply once the new programme comes into effect from April this year, April 2026, and that one element of the changes to those rules will be to make it easier to support and fund the maintenance of existing assets, so to make sure that we keep those critical existing assets in good condition.
Yeah, great, thank you.
You are confident that you'll have met your 52,000 properties by the end of this month?
Yes,
Right.
I mean, yes, obviously we haven't got the final outturn, but we're confident we're on trajectory for that.
Right. In the meantime, though, presumably there are other properties that are coming on stream as being at risk of flooding. Have you any assessment of that?
So you're absolutely right, and so the commitments made in the spending review and the infrastructure strategy announced last year are to we've now got a commitment to a 10-year forward programme for flood, which we estimate will benefit over 900,000 properties in the lifetime of that programme. The detailed metrics for the next year, we're just working through those now, so we will produce interim targets towards that. But that's the government is making a forward commitment of around an additional 7.5 billion of capital towards that programme. So that's a very that commitment reaches beyond the next spending review, obviously, so that's an important step in terms of long-term flood resilience.
So 900,000 over a 10-year period, is it? That's roughly 90,000 a year, and you've taken 52. I mean, it sounds a bit like trying to fill a bath with the plug out.
So flood resilience is you're right that the challenge is we're always having to adapt in the face of climate change projections. So one of the things we are doing now with the forward programme is making sure climate change projections are factored into that. And one of the reasons we've changed the funding rules is to give us that better balance between, and give the agency, the Environment Agency, more scope to target resources where they're needed most, because one of the things we're seeing with the pace, with the frequency and severity of extreme weather events occurring is that takes its toll on our existing flood assets. So I think you're right. We have to keep investing in this, but this is a major commitment that we're making, and that time horizon, I think, also allows us to bring forward some of the really significant projects that will have the maximum impact.
Okay. Josh, you've got some questions in relation to cross-departmental collaboration.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So we've asked you quite a few questions already on the capacity of the department. So in light of the pressures that are obviously on DEFRA, what are you doing to work with other departments to pool capacity and make sure that your priorities as a department and those of the government are being delivered on?
So that's quite a big question. We don't tend to pool capacity as such, as in, sometimes you might, but bring different groups of officials from different organisations together into a single team. We tend not to do that, but we do enormous amounts of joint working across the different departments. Has already referred to some of the work that we're doing with devolved administrations. I mean, it's not just on the SBS where we work with devolved administrations, but I think we're one of the departments that does the most work with devolved administrations within Whitehall. And actually, it is one of those areas where the Cabinet Office, who's responsible for that relationship, would tend to look at DEFRA as one of the more better practice departments within Whitehall. I think in terms of other departments we work very closely with, so we work very closely with DESNES, particularly when it comes to marine issues, the marine spatial squeeze, but also actually some of the on-land infrastructure challenges. One of the innovations that we've introduced in recent months is to have an infrastructure board, which is chaired by the Director General of Environment and brings together different departments focused on the sort of top 50 infrastructure developments within the country, and thinking about whether or not environmental regulations could become a challenge to those progressing. David runs with his minister something similar on the water side, specifically a water delivery task force, again bringing in different departments as required. So we do a lot of work with DESNES, we do a lot of work with MHCLG, particularly around the planning reforms. So the development of the Nature Restoration Fund, for example, which is being led by Natural England as one of our arm's length bodies, is nevertheless being overseen by a sort of mixture of DEFRA and MHCLG. We do a lot of work with the Department for Transport when it comes to air quality, for example. We do a lot of work with the Department of Business and Trade when it comes to trade issues, again, in Emma's patch. So we are a department that works with an enormous number of different agencies, the Home Office as well, when it comes to sort of issues around border force. So it's probably, I'm trying to think whether there is a department we don't engage with, actually, because we engage with a huge number of departments in the normal course of our work. I think one of the things I would say sort of slightly goes back to the very beginning is I'm really keen that DEFRA comes to that table confident about the important contribution we have to make, not just as an economic department, but also as a national security department. It was quite interesting to me that when I got this role, one of the first people to reach out to me was the chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee to say that DEFRA is an important player within the intelligence community as a national security department. Very much something that my predecessor was focused on and something I want to build on. So lots and lots of areas where we work well.
One of the things that Charlie referred to was the Environmental Improvement Plan. I think DEFRA is responsible for 89% of commitments within the new EIP. Do you think that's fair, given that every sector has an environmental impact?
Well, a lot of the work that we do in the department is by definition work where we need other people to do it, if that makes sense. And either that's other government departments or it's behaviours that we want to influence. So actually, if you just go back to what are we trying to do through the environmental land management schemes, yes, we are the funding provider and we shape the policy, but the actual work is being done by farmers and land managers. So, every area of outcome that we focus on as a department requires us to think about the behaviours that we are seeking to influence of individuals, of consumers, of companies. Emma's overseeing the waste reforms, for example. That is all about how do we influence consumer behaviour, packaging company behaviour. So it's fine, I think, that DEFRA has the principal responsibility for driving these things through. It doesn't mean we're doing all of the work. A lot of what we need to do is understand the behaviours and how we nudge and change and incentivise different behaviours, whether that's in other departments or whether it's in the country at large.
I think you feel like other departments are willing to come on that journey. Have you had resistance, difficulty engaging with any?
We have our differences occasionally with different departments. I think the Chair was alluding to some earlier on, but we fight our corner on behalf of our sectors and on behalf of the outcomes we're trying to deliver. But that's the normal stuff of cross-government working. It's not. I haven't noticed anything different or unusual or unexpected since I've been at DEFRA.
Well, I was just going to add a sort of live example of where the opposite, I think, is true, where actually we don't encounter resistance. We sort of encounter other departments really leaning in and wanting to work with us, particularly where we see environmental objectives and other objectives like public health align. As an example, on Friday, I joined a task force which Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer, has agreed to chair for us on looking at essentially the evidence base underpinning public health in relation to water, both bathing waters and drinking water. And so, so Chris has been happy to lean into that work, accept that commission from DEFRA ministers, and leading that work on behalf of government as a whole. And obviously that gives us access to his ability to sort of convene science academia to support that strand of our work. So I think where this is an important part about how we work as a department is really to be able to draw down all of that expertise wherever it sits elsewhere in government, because clearly public health and the water environment are absolutely intrinsically connected.
Yeah, there have been some areas where I think concerns been raised about how well we're doing sort of on cross-governmental efforts on the environment. So the OEP flagged what they feel is inconsistent engagement from senior officials and ministers across government, not just DEFRA, with the environmental principles policy statement. And repeated findings have also flagged a lack of progress across government on climate adaptation as well, and the feeling that's really falling short. So you mentioned, Paul, advocating to other departments. What are you doing to make sure that there's strong action in those areas where people are raising concerns?
Yeah, so I think that there will always be challenges along those lines, and I think it's good to hear them. I will reflect on both of those ones that you've just raised. It's part of my job sometimes to go and have a conversation with the Permanent Secretary of other departments and make sure this is being given the priority, whatever the issue is being given the priority in the department. As I say, I think generally speaking we have really good, positive working relationships across all departments. Sometimes we will disagree, sometimes we all want to place more emphasis, or the departments to place more emphasis. Environmental principles is a good example, but it's work in progress, and I suppose what I say is I hear you and I'm happy to make sure that I'm leading into that challenge.
There's some positive things I could say though on our work on adaptation. Some things I think we've thought have had an impact. One is in the last spending review, all departments, when they put forward their spending bids, we agreed with the Treasury that departments would have to articulate how those investment proposals would meet climate adaptation objectives and climate resilience. We've just recently, worked with the Treasury to revise the Green Book, so the appraisal guidance. So sort of hardwiring some of these things into the way spending decisions and investment decisions are made really, really important. And similarly on the underpinning science and research, our Chief Scientific Advisor co-chairs a board drawing together the Chief Scientific Advisors across government, co-chairs that with the Government Chief Scientific Advisor, Dame Angela McLean. So again, that whilst not residing from the challenge from the Committee on Climate Change, I think there are some things we are seeking to do to really make sure climate resilience is properly embedded across the government machine.
Okay. Just lastly, another responsibility for DEFRA from a cross-governmental perspective is rural proofing, and that's something that I've heard the Secretary of State reference several times. The last rural proofing annual report was published in March 2024. So could you tell us when the next report is going to be published? Will it cover the last 2 years? And will this more clearly look at how well rural proofing is actually implemented on the ground, rather than simply explaining the government's policy in rural areas?
Yeah, shall I say a word or two about that? So the previous Minister for Rural Affairs, I think, sort of took stock of that approach to rural proofing reports, and I think concluded that he wanted to come up with something that was more forward-looking. So rural proofing reports, as we've produced them previously, have tended to look back at a range of initiatives across government and essentially assess how well did government do. I think what ministers were keen to do was give it more of a forward-looking approach to how are we going to target action to improve quality of life in rural communities. Ministers set up a rural task force to formulate a range of ideas. That was chaired by our lead non-executive director, Heather Hancock. That task force concluded towards the end of last year, so we're working through the conclusions of that work, so there will be a more proactive forward-looking rural report that we intend to bring forward as soon as we can. I fear that's another one where I'm saying as soon as we can. For, yeah. But the important point is a shift of approach to try and sort of draw in more directly expertise from rural communities to shape what that approach should look like going forward.
Just to come back on I understand why you're asking questions about when we're going to publish stuff. I just want to make sure that as a department we're focused on doing stuff, not just publishing documents. It is important from a public accountability perspective that we publish things as well. But actually there's a lot of work going on in the department, to your earlier point about engaging with different departments of state where we have influence over policy statements from different departments in the interest of rural communities. So, on housing, which obviously MHCLG lead, National Planning Policy Framework includes stronger support for rural, social and affordable housing. Again, DEFRA would have been part of those conversations. Transports, which DFT lead, obviously a big focus on buses and rural transport. Fuel poverty, which is a DESNES lead, again, a particular issue in many rural communities. Crime, there's a sort of rural and wildlife crime strategy that was published towards the tail end of last year. Obviously, we were very involved in that. So in all of these areas, we're sort of getting on with helping to shape policy in a way that works better for rural communities. So I wouldn't want you to see the sort of absence of a document from DEFRA about rural communities to be an absence of getting on with the job of supporting rural communities.
Absolutely, and on that point, how effective do you feel DEFRA has been at influencing announcements from other departments in the course of this Parliament so far? Do you think it's going well?
Very hard thing to judge.
You've given some good examples, but I think there are some examples where perhaps rural interests haven't been well considered, I think, in otherwise well-intentioned policy announcements. I can give you an example. MHCLG's Pride in Place funding is a massive part of local growth from the government. It utilised the Community Needs Index, which many people have said disadvantages rural communities because they're typically very tight-knit. People are more reliant on each other, and so they've got more trust in their neighbours, so they come out quite high on the Community Needs Index. So the fact that rural communities with quite acute deprivation are missing out on funding because of that, I think is an example of perhaps where rural proofing either hasn't took place or it hasn't been listened to. And I think we can all point to other examples. You mentioned Warm Homes Plan and the work that Desnes is doing on decarbonising home heating. Again, many of us who represent rural parts of the country are really concerned about the wholesale push for heat pumps because most of the properties where they're not appropriate are in rural areas where, for example, insulation is much harder to do. So although you've given some examples of where it is working, I think there are other quite major examples of where billions of pounds are being spent and rural communities perhaps are not being thought about. And I just wonder whether those representations are being made and, as I said, not listened to or not being made at all.
So I don't know the answer on that specific case, but I think your general point that that there are areas where we need to do more, try and make sure our voice is heard, I think is a reasonable.
Yeah, and just to add, I mean, I think on your sort of challenge around the evidence-based used to make funding judgments going forward, we have done some work recently with MHCLG on the revisions to the index of multiple deprivation and sought to make changes in that index to remove some of the metrics that I think we'd all recognise sort of perverse when applied to rural communities. So previously, car ownership was sort of used as a metric that frankly disadvantaged people in living communities where having a car is often a necessity in a way that so we sought to remove measures like that. So whilst I take the challenge about the specific fund that you referred to, I think getting the underpinning evidence base and the metrics like the IMD in a place which better reflects rural characteristics is an important step forward.
Thank you, Chair.
Just really briefly on that point, you piqued my interest with your reference, Paul, to spatial squeeze and your interaction with Desnes. As a department that you now want to focus on outcomes, what outcomes should the fishing industry expect as a consequence of your management of the spatial squeeze issue?
We have a set of different objectives as a department from that, some of which are around nature restoration within the seas and some which are around having...
That's things like MPAs.
MPAs, yeah. And then we want to see a thriving, profitable, productive fisheries industry in this country. Now, quite how we define that and the policies we put in place to deliver it, obviously the fund that we were talking about earlier is one mechanism through that. The design of the new fisheries management plans is a response to another challenge we've had around the nature of regulation. But so for me, that is a good example of where we need to be really clear, what does success look like, how are we going to define that, and what are the mechanisms we've got to actually deliver it.
I mean, the starting point has got to be there's got to be available sea for fishers to fish in.
Yes.
And if you've closed it off because it's an MPA and you've closed that off because there's a wind farm and you've closed that bit off because there's a fish farm and you've closed that bit off because there's a cable lying there on the seabed, it feels like it's always the catching sector that's left out and they're the ones who suffer as a consequence. What's your strategy to achieve an outcome that allows our fishermen to go to sea?
Well, you're right. We need to, I mean, a bit like the land use framework is looking at how do you prioritise. Well, to some degree, I think we've got the building blocks of a sea use framework in the way in which the combination of the Crown Estate and the Desnes work and the entry that we do. Yeah. Just on the seas, my understanding is that 80% of English seas are open for fishing of one form or another. Now, that is not to say there isn't the squeeze that you're describing, the challenge that you're describing, but our role is to make sure we can balance these different, so we have energy needs, we have nature restoration needs, and we have fishing needs, and our job, a bit like it is on land use, is to work out how to balance these, and they're not always trade-offs, of course, either, because you can do multiple things in one area. So but that's our job, right? Is to try and.
I mean, if you have things like compensatory MPAs where you are closing down water for in one area because of a development you're doing in the other, that's a double whammy for the fishing industry, isn't it?
So I do understand that point, though. My understanding is that compensatory MPAs are going to be very small, and it's going to be a one-off. So again, having the perspective on how big that problem is, but the broader problem you're describing around the squeeze and making sure that our seas provide an area where we can have a thriving fishing industry is absolutely an objective of the department.
Okay. Well, we will judge that when the outcomes too eventually. Henry, you've got some questions related to digital and data.
Thank you. Going back to data, so I just it's curious, and I suppose in terms of the sequencing discussions we've been having with ELMS, focus on public goods, focus on developing those environmental outcomes. But if you look at the metrics by which we're trying to decide how those will be delivered, there's a big void there. I mean, there's no metric for soil health. Half the metrics that you've got for the outcome indicators framework not fully developed. And in terms of the wider assessment about your environmental assets, with the natural capital and ecosystem assessment programme, I think that's not scheduled to come until 2029. So how are you, in the context of ELMS, why is it taking so long to get a clear picture? But how can you respond effectively that you're getting value for money in the first place, in respect of your environmental outcomes from the Environmental Land Management Scheme?
Yeah. That's a really good question, and one that we ask ourselves within the department a lot. I think a few things to say. So the first thing, specifically on ELMS, how do we know ELMS is going to be good value for money? I think there are three things you'd want to look at. One is, what's the underlying evidence base that taking certain actions lead to environmental improvements? The second is, are farmers responding to ELMS and doing those actions? And then the third is more the output or outcome metrics that you're describing. I think we can be very confident on the first and the second of those. So the sort of actions we are encouraging farmers to take through ELMS, there's decades of evidence base around the benefits of certain activities in terms of improving soils and hedgerows, etc. So the actions that we are encouraging are well evidenced in terms of their potential to deliver economic benefit. We can then obviously monitor the additionality, like to what degree are farmers doing things as a result of ELMS that perhaps they wouldn't have done before. The additionality bit is tricky, but we definitely know how many farmers are taking up ELMS schemes. I think it's about 40,000 at the moment, so almost half of all farmers are involved in SFI. So we know what works through the evidence base. We know how many farmers are taking it up. The more challenging bit is then doing the actual environmental assessment of what has happened as a result of that. And that is challenging in two ways, as it often is when we look at sort of performance and outcomes in the world of DEFRA. One is, can you actually measure it? And that's really, really hard. So you're right, we don't have a systematic national soil health evidence base, but you're also right that the NCA is our mechanism for doing that. It's a really big investment, £300 million investment into strengthening the evidence base and the monitoring system that we have across our natural assets. You're right that some of it does not come online until 2029, but that is a work in progress and a really important piece of work for us to do. Being able to measure it is one thing. Being then able to attribute changes to specific policy interventions is arguably even harder. So we might well see improvements, I hope we do, in our environmental natural assets that come through the NCA over time. Will we be able to sort of say, well, we know what caused that, it was this, that attribution is difficult as well. So all of this is basically just to say to you, the question you're asking is a really good and fundamental one to the whole organisation. We ask it a lot. We have degrees of confidence in some aspects of the evidence base. So we are very confident as we go out with our SFI offer, and will do in June, that we are asking farmers to do things we know have a very good evidence base in terms of environmental impact, and we will then see whether the farmers wish to do those things. And recent history suggests that they will. We are building the monitoring system that we need through NCAEA principally that will allow us to judge the impact on natural capital in this country over time.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to have to move forward, but that was helpful. In terms of, Dave, can I ask you a question about the Water White Paper in terms of monitoring? So I think the Water White Paper said you've got to optimise the current monitoring framework for the water environment. That's plans within the Water White Paper. Can I ask what that would look like?
Yeah, so a number of things. I mean, there's obviously been a significant investment in recent years in monitoring against CSOs, storm overflows. We're introducing monitoring coverage for emergency overflows as well. We're also looking to strengthen open monitoring, so move away from operator self-monitoring undertaken by water companies into something that makes much better use of open data, digitization and automation, and continuous water quality monitoring. So not just sort of monitoring events, discharges of sewage, but also continuous monitoring of the quality of rivers, etc. So there's a kind of range of things that we're trying to do in that programme. Okay.
Well, I mean, is that on? I mean, in the context of the resourcing point that we discussed about earlier, the EA and the natural resources Wales,
yes, of course.
There are significant monitoring gaps in the context of tighter resources. Are you going to be, how will you be working with them in the context of trying to strengthen the? Because it's all very well having a piece of legislation, but if that legislation can't be enforced on the ground, what steps are you taking to make sure that one can follow the other?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of EA resourcing, one of the things we've done and are doing is strengthening their ability to cost recover in relation to many aspects of water regulation. So I think for context, the amount of charged income that the EA receives for its environmental protection budget in the round has increased by about 150 million since 2020. So I think the plans we've set out in the white paper sort of take a realistic view of the spending review settlement. So I feel confident that where we've set out these plans to strengthen our monitoring arrangements, they're baked into our spending review plans, and also the measures we're taking to strengthen the EA's ability to raise revenue from other sources.
Thank you. I'm jumping around a bit, but if I come back to the manifesto commitment around procurement, so the government, in terms of 50% of public sector food procurement, to be locally sourced, and we haven't really seen that much development on that policy in terms of announcements. Is that due to an inability to collect data on the current sourcing patterns from the department, or is it partly to do with that?
We're certainly spending time at the moment focused on the data question, yes.
Thank you. And the last question I had was around IT systems. So I think you spent 300 million to upgrade your IT systems between 22 and 25, but you had a report in 23 that you were one of the largest legacy IT burdens in central government. So I wondered whether you could give an update on how you are in respect of that.
Very happy to. You're right. So 2023 NAO report said that we had the second largest legacy IT. I've always wondered who has the largest, actually. I should work that out at some point. But I think historically it identified three barriers to change. One was investment, second was skills, and the third was underlying data. I would say we've made progress on all three of those. So, as we sit here now, where are we at? So we had 300 legacy applications that were considered high risk. We have remediated over 200 of those, and we expect to sort the rest in the next 18 months. We've undertaken a lot of improvements in online services. GDS now reviews a number of our services as excellent. We have a number of common platforms under development, and we have implemented a number of digital services in Emma's previous area around circular economy, for for example, around packaging reforms, digital waste tracking. So we've done the sort of underlying remediation, or we're well on track with the underlying remediation. We are then transforming a number of services, and I mentioned earlier on some of the services in the digital infrastructure within ALBs, which is a big priority for the coming years from the SR settlement. And then the final area, I suppose, is more about sort of cutting-edge technologies and the use of AI, where, I mean, I've been surprised actually coming into DEFRA about the degree to which we are applying and testing AI in different areas. I think we have about 20 different pilots where we're trying AI out at the moment, and some of that is about service delivery and trying to make services more frictionless. Some of it is very specific stuff to DEFRA around sort of peatlands and using AI to look at satellite imagery of peatlands, which helps us with rewetting peatlands. So there's a sort of three-tier approach: the sort of remediation of the challenges from the NEA report, the digital transformation of various in-house services, and then some more cutting-edge AI work that's going on. In terms of skills, which was the kind of second barrier, I think we're in a much better place. I don't know if Iain wants to come in, but we're in a much better. We were in a world where we had an enormous amount of contingent labour as a proportion of our overall digital workforce. That is now much, much lower. We have many more in-house digital skills. I would say it is still a challenge for us, and it's one of the areas we need to continue to upskill within the department. And then just very briefly on data, we took a new approach from 2024 where we recruited a new chief data officer who set out a strategic roadmap, and we're now in a world where we have for the first time a DEFRA-wide data catalogue, shared data assets, data standards, and a new data services platform which has about 5.3 million hits on it. I think it's got about 20-odd outward-facing apps. So over recent years, there's been quite a change. It's work in progress. There are big digital transformation challenges ahead over the next few years, particularly around some of the ALB services. But I think we're in a much better place now than we were at the time of the NAO report in 2023.
Thank you, Chair.
Just before we release you back out into Whitehall, Henry's point about ELMS and measuring outcomes, achievements, sounds like a very resource-intensive piece of work. I think Minette Batters told us that the number of people in the RPA administering BPS was around about 150, whereas already those administering SFI are north of 900. So that's a chunky increase already. How many more are we going to have administering schemes rather than actually getting money into the pockets of farmers at the end of the day?
Well, that takes me right back to the point I made at the beginning about us becoming a more efficient department over time, and picks up the question about digital. So in many of the areas, there is the opportunity through digital transformation, potentially through AI, to do things in a more frictionless, faster way for customers, and reduces pressures on headcount within the organisation. It takes time, and we have to be careful that we get that right. I mean, RPA is a great example where, as I mentioned earlier, we have creaky IT. There are limits to what we can do about it. We've got an excellent new chief executive who comes from more of an IT background, and he is chomping at the bit to get on with the digital transformation of the organisation, but we have to tread through that carefully. But of course, we always want to be moving as much money as we possibly can into frontline services or out to the people who we are here to support, rather than building up numbers of civil servants in the department.
So that 900 figure that Minette gave us for those administering SFI, have you any notion yet of where that figure is going to go in the future?
I confess that is not a figure that I've got in my head, and so I'm not quite sure what that captures. I certainly couldn't answer where it might go in the future.
No, okay. Right, well, listen, thank you very much. There's other matters that we may actually just raise in correspondence around some of the accounting figures that we've been given. So, Iain, that will be a little joy for you to look forward to. But for the meantime, I think that concludes our session for today. Thank you very much for your attendance and for your engagement. It's been exceptionally interesting. And I think we will return to a lot of this at some future date, either with yourself or your ministerial colleagues. But for the moment, thank you very much. Order.